This year, in my 11th year of gardening, my garden will look different than it ever has. If you've listened to the podcast or watched some of my YouTube videos from the spring of last year, then you know I suffered from a herniated disc in my back, which made gardening all but impossible during the busiest months of the year. Thankfully, I had already made my garden plan, and thankfully, my family pitched in to help, but that experience opened my eyes to just how much I had let my garden and life get out of hand. I kept adding more and more each year without regard to my capacity to be able to maintain it. I was forced to slow down in more ways than one. I spent a lot of time in contemplation and prayer, and as I did that, I began to feel strongly that 2024 needed to be a year of paring down significantly. I made the decision that, with few exceptions, I would take a year off from preserving and instead focus on growing a fresh food garden for 2024. Make no mistake, this will be a huge change for me. My entire 10 years of gardening have been built on production for preservation. Thankfully, though, over the past few years, I've started learning how to plan and grow food for fresh use for longer in the season. But 2024 will be the year where I'm forced to make use of every season so I don't miss out on as much when it comes to what we normally would have preserved. I'm actually really excited about this. Not only do I look forward to what this load off my plate will offer me, but I'm excited for the challenge. I'm excited to be forced to put into practice more than ever what I teach in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, which, by the way, opens on Tuesday, February 6th. I'm excited to be forced to work as much food into a small space like many of you do. So as I've been planning my garden, I'm going to share with you today what practices I am putting into place to create a year-long fresh food garden in a kitchen garden space with minimal preserving. Before we get into the strategies of fresh food gardening, I want to invite you, if you haven't heard yet, we are having a free Productive Garden Masterclass being held next week if you're watching this in real time. It starts on February 6th through 8th. This is such a popular class. We do this every year, and this year we're offering 5 because we want to make sure that you can fit it into your schedule. Now, you'll hear me touch on some concepts today that we'll be exploring more, and especially more in depth in the masterclass. Concepts like climate factors beyond your garden zone and your average frost dates, because knowing some of these climate factors will make a huge difference in your success. We'll also talk about what you need to know to successfully grow in 3 seasons, spring, summer, and fall. And that is really the crux of what I'm going to be talking about today, is planning for that. We'll talk about specific strategies that will help you with planting and harvesting more without spending more time in the garden and without expanding your garden space. We'll also talk about succession planting methods. This goes beyond just plant once and then take it out and plant again, even though that's one strategy. We'll talk about some other strategies that can actually serve you a little bit better, and personally that I use more, that can help you to harvest more and longer without expanding your space. Now, this is actually going to be a really fun class. For one thing, if you register, even if you can't come live or something comes up and you have to catch the replay, just from registering, you'll be entered into a big giveaway with products from some of my partners like Greenstock Vertical Planter, Birdie's Raised Bed, products from Organic Rev, and more. And if you are able to make it live, we'll have live giveaways throughout the class with some of my favorite products from Epic Gardening, Wood Prairie Family Farm, Organic Rev, Soil Kit, and more. So this is going to be fun. Not only will you get some strategies that'll help you in your garden, but you'll also have a chance to win a giveaway. And if you come live, there'll also be a product that you'll get for free. Just putting that out there, and want to make sure that you register as soon as you can so you can choose the time that works best for your schedule. So hit pause on this. If you haven't registered yet, go to journeywithjill.net/masterclass, pick the time that works best for you, and I'll meet you back here when you're finished. Okay, so let's talk about the 5 strategies that I am employing right now in my garden planning with the purpose of having fresh food for our entire year. Now, I say our entire year. This year was the first time that I really went headlong into a winter garden. And at the time of this recording, I'm looking back here, the temperature's risen to 5 degrees. It was 0 when I woke up this morning. So yeah, we'll see if everything survived in the greenhouse. But my whole purpose was hopefully to be able to have my salad greens to last me throughout the winter. We'll see if that actually worked. I'm hopeful. But anyway, even if you're not able to grow throughout the winter, if you don't live in a climate that you can, being able to grow in 3 seasons is definitely, one thing that you can achieve. So let's talk about the 5 things that I'm doing in my planning that I'm leaning into to try to be able to harvest as much as I can fresh and not having to rely so much on preserving. So number 1, this is something that if I mention this, my children will roll their eyes, because it's something that I have actually been leaning into a lot over the past few years, and it's not going to come as anything new, but I want to share it with you, and that is seasonal eating. When I first started gardening, my plan was to look at everything that we typically eat, including like canned goods, and I wanted to see how much of that can I grow and can myself so that I can eat it in the off season. And while that is still a good goal and probably one I'll return to next year, and honestly, one that I worked on this year to can as much as I could to last us not having to preserve this year, that's actually not going to be as much of a goal when it comes, or actually hardly a goal. There are a couple things I'm planning on canning, like pickled beets, and I do need some more sweet pickle relish. But besides that, most everything that I've canned in the past, I'm not going to can. Instead, I'll be leaning into seasonal eating. And what seasonal eating means for me as a gardener is whatever's coming out of the garden is what we're going to eat. For example, right before this cold snap, I harvested all my cabbage and I had a little bit of extra broccoli. So cabbage was what we ate. We had a cabbage soup, and then pretty soon I'll probably schedule some kind of a barbecue dish and make coleslaw. Typically, I don't do that when cabbage is not in season. On the flip side, when okra is coming in, okra is what we eat pretty much like 3 meals a week. We do fried okra, we do roasted okra, pickled okra. Well, I guess that's canning, but that's what my son likes is pickled okra. But we find ways to use okra when it's in season. You get the idea. So the point is that what we'll do is we'll eat what's in season. When asparagus comes on, we're eating asparagus for a lot of meals because it only comes on for a short time. And then once asparagus is gone, then eventually we'll have summer squash. And it's just amazing when you lean into the seasons at how the garden provides this for you. And what I love about seasonal eating, and this is where my kids would roll their eyes, is that when something's in season, we eat it a lot and we get sick of it. So when it's done, we're actually glad to move on to something else. But once we haven't had something for a year, it makes that next harvest so much nicer. The first time I harvest okra, my kids are so excited because they love okra. The first corn on the cob that we get, nothing compares to that anyway. Fresh corn on the cob, freshly harvested. They're excited about that because they haven't had it in a year. And another thing that this kind of goes in the back of my mind a lot, but I really feel like that we were designed and created to flourish by eating the food that's in season at the moment. And I'm sure there's studies to back me up, but I can't really put my finger on them at the moment. I know I've heard about them, but think about the things that we need most at different seasons when just a simple example, watermelon coming in season when we need extra hydration because it's hot and we're working in our gardens, right? Different greens are always in season in the cool parts of the climate. How does that? I'm sure there's a reason that our body needs that then. So if we think about how we were designed, I think our bodies are made to flourish by leaning into seasonal eating too. So that's what the first thing that I'm doing is leaning into seasonal eating and focusing on what I can grow and make sure that I have something harvesting for as long as possible. based on my climate. And I'm learning my climate. I'm still learning my climate. I'm still observing every year, even though I'm going into my 11th year. And I'm trying to test some boundaries and see, okay, how far can I go to continue to lean into the seasonal eating? Number 2 is I'm planning for 3 distinct seasons in the garden. I'm planning for cool season crops in the spring, warm season crops in the summer, and cool season crops in the fall, which carry on into, many of them do, cold season crops in the winter. So I'm planning for these 3 distinct seasons. I know, and this makes cool season crops a little bit easier. I know that I'm going to be planting, for example, carrots in 2 seasons. So I'm planting carrots in the spring and I'm planting them in the fall. I know when they're going to harvest, and that enables me to lean into seasonal eating. Now, the good news is that a lot of these crops that I'm growing, whether it be cabbage or carrots or onions, they're not perishable like tomatoes are, or peppers or cucumbers. I mean, without preservation for tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers, they're not going to last that long, right? Or squash. But with your cabbage and your onions and your carrots, they're going to last longer. My carrots last in the refrigerator for 6 months. And if you're interested in knowing how I do that, I've got a YouTube video on that. But that makes it perfect to have that harvest, and then it'll take me to the next harvest. But the point is that I don't have to do a year's worth of carrots in one go. I know that I'm going to be planting them in the spring, and I know I'm going to be planting them again in the fall. Same thing for broccoli and cabbage. And honestly, in the middle of the summer, there's so many other summer crops coming out, like squash and okra and corn, that, I mean, I don't really even need broccoli and cabbage in the middle of the summer because we have so many other things that are coming at that time. So that kind of takes us back to the seasonal eating part of it. But when I'm planning my garden, I have to plan for, here's what I'm going to plant first, like we heard in the last podcast episode. But then I'm moving into the warm season crops, and even moving from there into what I call the hot season crops, the ones that you plant a little later than like your tomatoes, but they take the heat a little bit better. And then we go back into cool season crops. And then we go into the colder ones that can take a little bit more of the cold. So I'm planning for all of these seasons in the garden. That leads me to number 3, succession planting. Succession planting is absolutely the key to fresh food eating for as long as possible. I'm not even sure that you can really fresh food eat as long as you can without incorporating succession planting. And that's why succession planting is such a central core to what I'm going to be teaching you in the Productive Garden Masterclass. I'm going to teach you some strategies that will help you in learning how to succession plant more successfully. And then in my online garden planning course, Dream to Garden, which opens on February 6th, I teach you how to schedule succession plantings based on your climate. So the ones we're talking about in the masterclass will kind of share with you what they are. And then in Dream to Garden, you learn how to put them on your calendar for your climate, because your succession plantings will happen at a different time, most likely, than mine. You need to figure out how it works best with your climate. But a couple of keys to knowing the succession planting for me. This is just a little bit of an insight into, for example, when I was planning all of this out just a couple of days ago in my garden, here are a couple of things that stood out to me. First, knowing a plant's end date. We talk about this in depth in Dream to Garden, but that's a big question. If you know that you want to plant a crop after another crop, well, you need to know when the first crop ends. For example, spinach. Okay, if I know spinach is a cool season crop and it loves the cold weather, I know that I want to plant a warm season crop after that, but when do I do that? Well, partly that comes from observation, because in my climate, I know that spinach starts to bolt right around my average last frost date, which is mid-April. So that's a pretty easy one for me because I've observed it in the past. But another thing that you can do, knowing the plant's end date, is you know the days to maturity. You look on the seed packet, you look on the plant tag at the garden center, or you Google it. You say, how long does this plant normally last in the garden until it matures? And then depending on the plant, sometimes you add some time based on if you have, harvest. Like, does it come to mature and then you harvest like with bush beans, or is it different? And again, we go into all that. I make it a lot simpler for you in Dream to Garden. But the whole point is you want to know how long will that crop be in the garden. For spinach, for example, it's the perfect plant to follow with tomatoes, or any other crop that I need to wait till after my average last frost date. So I take the spinach out and then I put tomatoes in. Another example is I've seen that lettuce tends to bolt in mid-May, depending on the variety. Some bolt sooner, like black-seeded Simpson typically is the first to become bitter, and some last longer, like Muir. But for me, lettuce then, if I know it's only going to last till mid-May, it's perfect to follow with peppers or sweet potatoes because they get planted a little bit later than some of the other warm season crops, and they love the heat. So that would be a perfect succession. So these are just two examples of knowing when your plant's end date is so that you can follow it with whatever the next season is. And the same thing can be true for knowing when your summer crops harvest and then following that with a fall crop. So we got number 1, seasonal eating, number 2, planning for 3 distinct seasons, and number 3, leaning into succession planting. Number 4 is what I call varied days to maturity. So I mentioned what days to maturity is. That's how much time you can expect a crop to be in the garden until it starts to harvest. And depending on the particular crop, you may have different varieties that take longer to harvest. Some of them will be small. Like if you look at okra, most okra that I've seen at least is right around the 50 to 55 day mark. But if you look at something else like watermelon, you've got some watermelons that'll harvest at or days to maturity, 60 days, maybe that early for some of the smaller ones. And then you've got others that are like 120 days. Well, what you can do, or what I like to do with that is I will get watermelon, for example, and I'll get several that are different days to maturity, and I'll plant them all at the same time, knowing that the smaller watermelons are going to come to harvest the first, and then they'll be followed by later ones. If I planted, which I did in the past, but if I planted all my watermelons and they were all the really long days to maturity, because I want these huge watermelons, they're great when they harvest, but they may not harvest till September. And if I want a watermelon in July, then I need to plant one with the shorter days to maturity. But I only have to plant once because all I have to do is select seeds that have different days to maturity and then plant them all at the same time. One example of how I'm doing that this year is with corn as well. One thing I was looking with corn, even though I preserved corn last year and we liked it okay, my goal will be to have corn on the cob as long as possible. But that's a little bit of a challenge because corn in particular, it tends to all harvest at the same time. When it's ready, it's ready. You can't leave it out there or it'll start getting mealy and it won't be good. And it also doesn't keep very long in the refrigerator. This sugars start breaking into starches pretty much immediately after you harvest, so they don't last that long. In order then for me to get corn on the cob as long as possible, I'm looking for different days to maturity corn. And I found in one of the seed catalogs, I can't remember which one it was. It might have been, it's either Territorial Seed Catalog or Southern Exposure maybe. But they had this corn bundle where they sent you 3 different varieties and they all had days to maturity that were about 10 days away from the other one. So what my plan is to plant them all at once, but they all are going to harvest like 10 days after the one before. So we have a little bit of a domino effect. I've never actually done that with corn before, but I've done it with watermelon and I've done it with other ones. And I'm actually kind of excited to see how that will go. But that's another example of how I'm using days to maturity in the crops that I'm choosing so I can get harvest for a longer interval. And number 5, this is probably one of my favorite things to do, especially when it comes to my salad greens, is to use staggered planting. This is something that I talk a lot more about in Dream to Garden, but it's really a simple thing to do. And I actually mention it in the Productive Garden Masterclass as well. And that is just to plant whatever crop you want to plant, especially if it's one that you're harvesting fresh and it's not going to stay out in the garden for super long, then you're going to plant it about every For me, every 2 weeks. You'll be planting it at intervals, just depending on the different crop. For me, I'm doing this with greens, my brassica greens, my arugula. And the purpose is once I start planting those at the end of January, I'll be planting new plantings every 2 weeks. You can do this with lettuce. You can do this with carrots. You can do this with beets. If you like beets fresh, I like to can mine, so I do them all at once. But the point is that by staggering your planting for every 2 weeks, then you're constantly having a fresh flow of whatever you've planted. I like to do this with arugula year round because I don't mind arugula in the summer. If you harvest it early enough, it doesn't get too spicy. Lettuce is a little bit more difficult because it'll get bitter more quickly. So I'm not able to do that for as long with lettuce. There's a point that I cut it off, that I stop doing it, and then I'll start it again in fall. But for some crops, and even for some locations, I know many of you who don't get super hot in the summer, you can do this for a lot of your plantings all season long to continually get harvest. And it may sound complicated, but it's not once you get it on your calendar. That's really the key, because once I've already scheduled all of this out in my calendar, which I just did this week, then all I have to do is just go on my calendar and say, okay, this week I plant this week I plant that. And it's pretty much a set it and forget it thing as far as the planning part. And then all you have to do is do it. And this is a strategy, along with all the others, that I'm going to be going into more detail in the Productive Garden Masterclass. But we'll also talk about some other strategies like multiple sowing, which is something I lean on heavily in my planning and my planting, companion planting, and several other different strategies. We're going to go into more depth in the Productive Garden Masterclass on that. So don't forget to register at journeywithjill.net/masterclass for that free masterclass. And there will be a replay if you can't be there live, but if you're live, then you'll be entered to win some of the giveaways we'll give away live online. I hope this was helpful for you, especially maybe, one thing that I've taken for granted as a gardener over the years is that everybody wants to preserve everything, because that's the way I went into my garden journey in 2013. I was a new stay-at-home mom, and I just wanted to put up everything that I could so that we could get as much as we could from the garden. And that's still something I figure I'll return to next year. But this year, I'm leaning into seasonal fresh eating. And to do that and to do it well, and hopefully not to experience lack from preserving, I'll be able to actually do that and enjoy my garden in a little different way. So if you're the type of person that maybe you don't want to preserve either, maybe you're in a stage of life that you just have to skip it this year like me, then utilizing these planning techniques will make this year's garden so much easier, and being able to harvest fresh for longer will make it so rewarding. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this was helpful for you, and I hope it inspires you to embrace a 3-season garden. Whether you choose to continue to preserve, or you just want more fresh food, or all you want is fresh food, I hope these strategies have been helpful. And like I said, I'll dive more into that in the Productive Garden Masterclass. And then if you're interested in more specific hand-holding, teaching you how to apply these to your garden in your climate, Dream to Garden opens in February, on February 6th. The doors are open until, I believe, February 13th. So if you're listening to this later, or you're watching this later, go ahead and go to the link and put your name on the wait list if you check that later and the doors are closed. But if you're watching this live or listening to this live, mark your calendars, because February 6th is when that will open. All right. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope that this has been helpful for you, and I will talk to you again on the next episode. Have a great day.